It was just after midnight when Isabel cupped her hand over Mateo's mouth and whispered, "Do not make a sound." The kitchen clock ticked like a countdown, and the air smelled of boiled cassava and stale sweat. Outside, voices moved in waves along the alley, and the sound of a motorcycle idled too close for comfort. The men who had come to collect last month had come back, angrier, and tonight they had a list that included the children. With a worn roll of bills in her bra, a faded photocopy of a birth certificate folded into a sock, and a small map scrawled on the back of an old grocery receipt, she made a decision that felt both urgent and inevitable. "We are leaving now," she told her children in a voice that tried to be ordinary, and opened the kitchen window. The threat was immediate and named. A man known only as Dantas had been making rounds, promising pain to anyone who delayed his payment. Neighbors had seen the sweep and turned their faces away. The husband had left traces in the form of gambling debts and empty promises. Staying meant the slow violence of humiliation and the fast violence of a door kicked open at dawn. Leaving meant stepping toward unknown water, a possibility of refuge, and a hope that the ocean could hold what the city refused to protect. Isabel felt the weight of the choices as a physical thing, heavy in her chest. But she also felt something else constrict and then loosen, a stubbornness she had been taught by her mother, Maria, and her grandmother, Rosa. She grabbed a canvas bag, the same one she had used to carry vegetables to the market, and shoved in notebooks, a hairbrush, a handful of crumpled bills, and the photocopy of the birth certificate. Mateo slid in his old action figure. Sophia pressed a tiny blanket to her face, and Luis held on to Isabel's shirt like it was a lifeline. Isabel climbed through the kitchen window first, pale paint scraped against her sleeve. The alley below tasted of rust and leftover rain. They ran with shoes slapping wet pavement and with bare feet when shoes were lost in the scramble. They passed the lighted doorway of Dona Neusa, who had once lent Isabel sugar and had now thrust a wrapped cake into her hands without asking. They walked past a shop where Jorge, a young boy who worked nights sweeping, looked up and dropped his broom, as if to say, "Go." At the docks, a man with salt on his beard named Tomas hesitated, then offered to take them across in the small motorboat he used for fishing. Nobody had asked for anything but safety. In the low light, a rusted ship sat half-grounded at the edge of the harbor like a swallowed memory, its hull pocked with holes and its name long rubbed out. If you believe a mother will cross an ocean with
only a prayer in her pocket, leave a like and subscribe this channel, because this is the story of how one family fled violence and found a secret that would change many lives. They left the concrete and the neon of the city for the salt and the hollow sky. The boat was small and smelled of diesel and old tar. Tomas steered with a practiced hand and introduced himself with a grunt. On deck, the children leaned over the rail and let the sea air slap their faces. The island they aimed for was a rumor more than a place, a fringe of mangrove and a handful of huts where families tended goats and fermented fish. Isabel counted each beat of the engine like a prayer. The map she had held in her hand was little more than a sketch, a name of a cove someone in the market had muttered, a promise of remoteness. The journey took hours under stars that seemed indifferent. When the boat finally scraped a dark shoreline, the island smelled of algae and rotting wood, and the relief that came was small and shaky. Elena, who ran a communal kitchen on the island, opened her arms before she had all the answers and helped carry their things to a single high hut where they could sleep on woven mats. The island community showed them kindness in small, steady measures. There was Anna, who tended goats and fixed nets, Pedro, who knew every hidden path, Rosa, who kept a ledger of who owed what and who gave food on credit, Jorge, who still had family ties in the city and made runs for supplies, and Lucas, the elderly fisherman who sang cough-riddled songs as he mended nets. They named themselves quickly and gave actions to their names. Elena boiled tea and told stories about the island as if stories could stitch torn nights together. For a while, they were simply grateful for the quiet. Isabel found work mending clothes and teaching the children to read by the light of a borrowed lamp. Days formed like shells on the shore, and for the first time in months they slept with doors closed in the daytime and without the taste of fear in their mouths. The first weeks were about survival and small acts of rebuilding. Isabel's backstory arrived in pieces as neighbors asked questions and she answered with short sentences. She had been born in a nearby town where her mother, Maria, had worked in a cassava mill, and her father had been a dock laborer who died in a collapsed shed when Isabel was a child. She remembered the smell of wet burlap, the clack of sacks being tied, the game of coins her father played at nights that ate their pay. As a teenager, she had moved to the city to find work and had met Fagner in a crowded factory canteen. They married young and had their first child, Matteo, within 2 years.
The marriage had not been a plan. It had been a survival strategy and a promise. Isabel learned to count the bills, to make rice stretch thinner than hunger, to smile when customers walked by the stall. When Fagner's debts grew, they grew in ways Isabel could not always see until threats started arriving. She learned to become small and to speak in measured tones. The loss that shaped her came slowly. A husband who became a stranger in the same bed. Nights spent listening for the crack of a bottle. The long quiet of years where her own name felt like a borrowed thing. Her teenage years had included a secret scholarship to night school, where she had learned to write neatly on ruled paper, saving every second period of the day to study arithmetic. That education was the thing that let her read the map someone had scrawled and understand coordinates when others might have dismissed them as scribbles. She had kept a small diary, pages jammed into the cavity of a mattress, where she had written small things like how Matteo had learned to whistle at 3, and how Sophia refused to eat cassava unless it was fried crisp. The diary became a witness of everyday persistence and of the slow erosion of trust. These paragraphs of memory sat like old stones inside her, heavy but stable, and they would later matter because they trained her to notice details, to hold facts, to see patterns. The island life was not free of fear. One night, as the full moon threw long hands of silver over the water, a storm gathered in the offing. Tomas warned them of shifting winds and a barometer of bad omens he had learned from his father. The storm built like a fist, sky bruising into black, and the sea began to climb with the deliberate cruelty of an animal. The motorboat they had used for the crossing was gone, taken by a tide or by other fishermen on a run. The community gathered to push and tie the small boats, but the water rose faster than hands. Palm fronds lashed like whips, and rain slammed the thatched roofs. Isabel watched as a wave took Lucas's small canoe and shoved it like a toy into the rocks. She felt for Matteo and Sophia and Louis with hands that could not stop shaking. Elena shouted over the noise, shouted for everyone to close the huts and to tie the children down. Jorge and Pedro hauled ropes and hauled people, and the storm became a mutual enemy that erased small differences for a brutal day. This moment of tension lasted a slow, long night. Wind screamed, percussion of rain on tin roofs was unrelenting, and the island teetered between losing crops and losing roofs. Amid this chaos, a larger force came into play. The rusted ship, visible earlier as merely an old hulking neighbor in the distance, was tossed like a broken toy by the swell and scraped its side on the reef near the island. It made a noise like a sorrowful bell, and then it lay half-settled on the nearby shoal. The villagers gathered, soaked and trembling, watching a hulking metal thing breathe steam and groan. Isabel felt a tug in her gut, like a compass pointing. The abandoned vessel contained a hollow like a mouth, and at dawn the islanders walked across slick rocks to inspect it. Inside, oil slicked the deck, and a faint smell of old tobacco lingered. The ship had been grounded for years, its name sanded smooth. It might have been a menace or a gift from the sea. Elena urged caution, but curiosity outweighed fear. When they climbed down into the shadowed belly of the ship, the air changed. It tasted metallic and cold. There were pictures nailed to a bulkhead and children's shoes in a corner, like ghosts of a life that was not their own. In a dark locker, they found a tin box, sealed with rust and time, and wrapped in oilcloth. Isabel's fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside lay a leather-bound journal riddled with salt stains, a folded chart of routes, and a packet of documents tied with a red ribbon. The journal smelled of iodine and soot. Mateo pressed his face to the paper and read aloud a line that made the hair on Isabel's arms stand up. A line about cargo lost years earlier and names that sounded like officials and companies long vanished. The discovery had an immediate, instinctive weight. This was not treasure in the sense of gold and coins, but evidence of something buried. Records of transactions and transfers that had been hidden when ownership and accountability mattered most. Their first read of the journal was clumsy and emotional. In the dim light, they whispered. Isabel read passages about shipments that never reached a port, and about names of people who were rumored to have disappeared at sea. There were dates that matched rumors of forced labor, mentions of an unregistered ledger, and references to payments made to certain men who bore names that echoed in local memory. The documents included a manifest with signatures that matched a municipal ledger Isabel had once glimpsed in a government office. It was as if the ship had kept a secret for decades and decided to vomit it out when the world was already in pieces. Elena touched the edges of the paper with the reverence of someone who believed paper could be sacred. Jorge snapped a picture with an old phone. Pedro asked cautiously what they would do with such a find. Dantas would not know where to stand with this kind of evidence, but powerful people did not like exposure. Lucas muttered that things like this had sent men to prison once before, and also had erased lives. At 33% of the way through the journey of their lives on that island,
Question arrived for you who watch. If you found a fragment of your past that could hurt some and heal many, would you reveal it or hide it? Answer in the comments with one word, reveal or hide. And if you choose reveal, tell us in a sentence why you would risk it. Your words matter here and may become part of a conversation that helps others. The days after the find were a blur of small, urgent decisions. They copied the journal first with the old phone and then with a borrowed scanner that Jorge ferried from the city. Those copies were saved to a thumb drive and kept in Elena's locked chest. Names that showed up in the manifests matched rumors Isabel had overheard in the city about a port forged with complicity, about shipments that never left the boss's hold. They began to suspect that the ship was linked to a larger scheme of smuggling and disappearance that had touched many lives. The islanders met in the communal hut to decide next steps. Some wanted to hand everything to the authorities and let the prosecutors take it. Others feared corruption and suggested sending the materials to a university historian, someone like Professor Mendez, who specialized in maritime histories and who had published work on unregistered transports. Isabel remembered a contact from a market vendor, a story of a professor who had worked on similar records. They arranged a secret trip to the mainland under the cover of a supply run. When they reached the city, each movement felt surveilled. Tomas, who had ferried them across, was careful and watchful. They encountered a desk clerk named Fabio in an archive, who agreed to look at the documents without making a public registry. The first technical step they pursued was authentication. The process of forensic document analysis took place with a conservator at a university. The conservator examined paper fibers, ink composition, and the binding glue. She used a simple method of solvent tests and microscope photos to date the paper and to match the ink to a known formula used in the region in the early 80s. The explanation given by the conservator was precise and simple. She said that aging of cellulose fibers and solvent migration profiles are consistent with a document exposed to salt air and storage in a sealed metal container for several decades. This technical reassessment gave them confidence to push forward. The first formal contact was Professor Mendez, who read the journal and felt the floor drop. He identified shipping references that suggested a pattern of unregistered movements between ports used in periods of political violence. He proposed a controlled verification path that involved institutional partners. They needed a chain of custody to avoid allegations of tampering. The chain of custody required cataloging each item with unique labels, photographing them in situ, sealing them in archival bags, and logging every person who handled them into a ledger. This step is procedural and strict,
but necessary to ensure the documents hold weight in court or in public inquiry. Elena and Isabel watched as a process that felt clinical became their shield against accusations of fabrication. As the documents moved from village chest to professors' hands to a university lab, pressure appeared from unexpected directions. Men who still acted as if the island was a territory to be policed arrived in the nearby coastal bar asking casual questions that were not casual. Dantus's name surfaced in a different breath. He muttered about belonging and ownership like a claim. One evening at the small bar where fishermen mended nets and drank in low voices, a stranger called Raphael leaned too close. He asked where they had found the journal and who was behind the movement of the documents. When Jorge answered with a flat denial, Raphael laughed and said, "You do not want people digging into old ships." He left the bar with a threat that tasted of teeth and of money. That threat signaled a new danger, the one that would not only ruin lives but erase evidence. If evidence could be bought or destroyed, then the truth could be buried as if it had never existed. A tense confrontation followed a few nights later when men arrived on speedboats with flashlights and a willingness to intimidate. They came asking for the family that had arrived from the city. The islanders closed their doors and pretended sleep. Pedro and Ana stood at the edge of the sand and met the men with faces that showed steadiness rather than weakness. A conversation took place in bits and pieces of shouted phrases and measured replies. One man demanded names and said, "Show us the papers." Pedro answered, "We have nothing to hide." Ana said, "Those papers belong to no one here." The men left with a warning, "Handle what you find, and someone will teach you to be careful." The warning was a claim and a threat. Isabel felt the old fear burn up again like acid. She found herself wondering how far those men would go if the papers threatened to implicate someone important. Would they set fire to the ship? Would they harm people who could point to signatures and ledgers? The island, once simply a refuge, had become a place of potential violence. The discovery then expanded into an institutional stage. Professor Mendez reached out to an NGO that specialized in human rights investigations. The NGO suggested submitting the documents to the public prosecutor's office for formal investigation and asked for a sealed transfer accompanied by affidavits. That meant compiling witness statements and recording chain of custody declarations. The process required a small expedition to the National Archive to cross-reference names and to uncover any missing public records. The team found archival gaps where there should have been logs and manifests. Files had been mislaid or intentionally removed during turbulent periods. The researchers flagged inconsistencies that caught attention. A young journalist named Paula from a regional paper got wind of the findings and agreed to hold the story until the legal team was ready. That coordinated quiet was strategic. Professor Mendez insisted on verification before publication to ensure that the story could not be dismissed as rumor. The first big moment of tension came when the team authorized a controlled re-entry into the ship to retrieve additional items.
The islanders were afraid that the ship could be stripped or vandalized. They planned for a daylight operation with proof of ownership and with media present as witness. On the morning chosen, fog lay low and the water gleamed like pewter. People from the community showed up to stand by the perimeter. As the team stepped into the ship's hold to retrieve a sealed trunk, men in a black SUV pulled onto the nearby road. Phones rose and hands grasped at jackets, and the air smelled of diesel and cigarette ash. A man stepped out who looked vaguely familiar from old port records, a man who had been a minor official in previous administrations. He asked what they were doing and offered official-looking documents suggesting permission was unnecessary. The standoff lasted minutes that felt like hours. The air vibrated with the possibility of physical conflict. Then, with cameras recording and a journalist present, the man withdrew without incident, the presence of witnesses serving as a deterrent. This moment of tension underscored the importance of strategy and of bringing light to places that might otherwise be easy to plunder. The team then began the slow, meticulous work of authentication that would make the documents usable in court and in public debates. Forensic document examiners performed ink dating, paper analysis, and handwriting comparisons. They used ultraviolet light to detect overlays and erasures. They performed spectroscopy to identify components of the ink. A maritime historian cross-checked names and voyage numbers. The judicial branch assigned a preliminary inquiry, and an investigator named Helena came down to interview witnesses and collect testimony. The legal explanation that Helena gave in a recorded session was concise. She said that establishing provenance is about corroboration, chain of custody, and independent technical verification that can withstand motions in court. The procedure required multiple independent verifications, which the NGO coordinated with university labs. As the evidence stacked up, the narrative shifted from a single family's desperate escape to a public story about accountability. The journalist Paula published an in-depth piece with scanned images and interviews that sensitively presented the islanders' role. Public reaction was immediate. Community groups pressed for inquiries and civil society organizations demanded transparency. The public prosecutor's office opened a formal case that named potential suspects related to forced shipments and missing laborers. When the case was opened, it reverberated through institutions and corners of power. People on both sides began to mobilize lawyers and to call in favors. The island, which had been a blurred edge on some maps, was suddenly a focal point for a national conversation. Local radio shows debated whether the find was a hoax or evidence. Public demonstrations appeared in the city square with signs demanding truth. During preparation for public disclosure, a delicate ethical question surfaced: what to reveal and when to reveal to protect witnesses and families. The legal team decided to delay full disclosure until protective measures were in place for vulnerable witnesses like Isabel and her children. They registered protective addresses and sought restraining measures against known threats. The court issued orders, and public defenders prepared an affidavit. At the same time, the team arranged for exhumations in a nearby cemetery where family members suspected that some missing people might be buried without records. The exhumation process was logistically difficult and emotionally heavy, and involved forensic osteologists who used DNA sampling and anthropological methods to attempt identification. The forensic explanation given by the osteologists was, precise DNA matching requires a reference sample, and the search for relatives willing to provide genetic material was sensitive and necessary. That process began to give names back to bodies and to open long-shuttered grief. One of the most dramatic episodes came when men came in at night trying to remove the trunk from the ship. They moved with motorized winches and ropes. The islanders rose as one to block them. Pedro grabbed a flashlight and swung it at an approaching man. The men in the boats were surprised by the level of opposition, and by the way Elena, Jorge, Ana, and others placed themselves between the intruders and the ship. Voices rose and threats were exchanged. Suddenly, a light blinked in the distance, and a police patrol boat appeared as if summoned. The intruders retreated. The scene had been dangerous, and it had required a community to stand together. That moment underscored that protection can be built from people who choose to take small, brave actions at the right time. The investigation proceeded through hearings and subpoenas. Witness statements were given and recorded. Isabel offered her testimony in a quiet room with a recorder humming on the table. She described the night they left the city and the taste of cold in the kitchen, the way Mateo had clung to a toy, the smell of the sea when they arrived, and the shock of finding the journal. Her voice sometimes broke and sometimes was steady. She spoke in first person. In parts, the recorder caught her exact words, and they became official testimony. The public prosecutor took statements from families who had lost relatives in suspicious circumstances and cross-referenced shipping manifests. The documents from the ship matched those manifests and proved that certain cargoes were redirected to unknown locations and that bribes had been paid to overlook irregularities. The legal case assembled slowly and methodically, like a structure that had to stand scrutiny. The courtroom phase arrived with its own kind of tension and spectacle. Accusations were lodged against a handful of men, including former port managers and intermediaries. Lawyers argued about chain
of custody and about whether the documents could be considered primary evidence. Defense attorneys raised doubts about provenance and about the potential for tampering. The prosecution called forensic experts who walked through the authentication steps, explaining ink dating, paper fiber analysis, and cross-referencing with government ledgers. The technical explanation provided in court was careful and formal. It described how chromatographic analysis isolated ink components and how fiber density and isotopic signals matched paper manufactured in a certain period and region. Judges listened and sometimes pushed back on details. Public interest made the courtrooms tense. Outside courts, crowds gathered and chanted and called for justice. Among the high-tension episodes was a late-night raid ordered by unknown actors who tried to snatch the original documents from the university lab. The alarms went off and metal doors slammed. Security guards boxed around the storage room like an island of resistance and held firm. The raid lasted minutes that felt like ages. In the aftermath, the prosecution tightened security and moved key items into state-controlled repositories. That raid had been the proof everyone feared, a confirmation that there were actors who preferred secret dealings to public scrutiny. The raid also triggered public outcry and accelerated procedural protections. The case was no longer just about evidence, it was about the capacity of a state to defend truth. The climax of public exposure came when the prosecutor presented a consolidated report showing links between ship manifests, bank transfers, and testimonies of port workers. The report recommended charges against several men who had orchestrated payments and directed shipments that led to forced disappearances and hidden labor. The hearings were long. The testimonies from workers who had been coerced or who had seen shipments discontinued were wrenching. A former crew member gave a detailed account of a voyage where laborers were taken aboard and not properly registered. He cried as he recalled names and events. The testimonies were human and unglossed and made the abstract idea of corruption into faces and dates. The court acted to issue indictments and to call for reparations for families who had lost relatives. The initial judgments were not final, but they were a statement that evidence had teeth. There were moments of reprisal. A lawyer who worked for the prosecution received veiled threats, and one of the NGO staff members found his home broken into. The island received anonymous letters suggesting it would be better to forget. Elena responded by organizing a support net, a schedule of people who would check on each other and keep watch. The community turned protective measures into a ritual. Nights were shared and radios kept tuned. This communal watch was a practical form of resistance, and it demonstrated that protection can be woven from ordinary acts of care. As trials progressed, small victories arrived. Records were found in municipal stores proving that some officials had redirected funds. Families were invited to review case files. A commission was assembled to recommend reparations
and to propose a memorial for those whose names had been recovered. The commission recommended exhumations where appropriate, and the creation of a small island memorial with plaques and a list of names to honor the disappeared. The public prosecutor's office announced that it would open a larger inquiry into the economic networks that had supported illegal shipments and undocumented labor. The islanders were named as essential witnesses, and their role was reframed from peripheral to central. The months that followed were strenuous and hopeful. Isabel enrolled the children in a small school supported by a local NGO. Mateo learned to write longer stories and to help his mother with accounting. Sophia took to the sea and watched the horizon for incoming boats. Luis chased goats and learned to climb the small trees that dotted the island. The community slowly repaired roofs and painted the hut where Isabel and her family lived. They invited people who had been impacted by missing labor and coerced hiring to the island to find testimonies and to build a place of remembrance. The island became both a site of refuge and of unveiling. An epilogue of weeks and months followed the court actions. 1 month after the publication and the first official filing, the islanders noticed a new rhythm. Media visits were less frantic and more respectful. The prosecutor's office had issued preliminary subpoenas and showed a willingness to hear protected testimony. The initial protective orders were in place, and the NGO had funded temporary relocation assistance for families who feared direct reprisal. Isabel wrote in her notebook that she felt both exhausted and relieved, a feeling of being unstitched and restitched by the same event. Statistically, the case had moved from rumor to record, and the island had become a node in a larger network of memory. 3 months into the aftermath, there were more concrete motions. The public prosecutor had requested exhumations in 2 cemeteries where testimony suggested that laborers had been buried without records. The forensic team performed careful exhumations and recovered remains that were then compared by DNA to relatives. The identification process was difficult and methodical, but it produced results. Families received names where once they had only absence. The Commission on Reparations proposed a modest fund and legal steps toward restitution. Trials were ongoing and some arrests had been made. Meanwhile, the island had started a small community archive, cataloging documents, oral histories, and items recovered from the ship. Volunteers from a university assisted in conservation and in building a modest exhibit that told the story of the discovery and of the people who had come forward. Isabel visited the exhibit and stood by the case that held the journal, fingers tracing the glass as if to reassure herself that the story she had stumbled upon had a place in public memory. 6 months after the discovery, life had shifted but not completed its course. 2 men had been formally indicted and a preliminary trial date had been set.
The public prosecutor's office announced a review of port management procedures and promised reforms aimed at ensuring better record-keeping and oversight. Local politicians pledged to fund a small memorial at the quay and to implement programs to support families of missing workers. Isabel's children were enrolled in a stable school, and she had secured part-time work teaching literacy classes on the island. The community that had sheltered them received recognition by an NGO that provided material support for rebuilding roofs and for a small boat for safe crossings. The island's story had become an example of how quiet refusal and collective action could open closed doors. In private moments, Isabel reflected on what they had lost and what they had found. She had lost the illusion that safety could be absolute and had gained a deeper trust in strangers who became allies. The journal that had surfaced from the ship had not held silver or gold, but it had held names and ledgers and the bones of accountability. The case had not yet concluded, but many small acts of justice had been set in motion. The island had become a site of contested memory and of public reckoning. Isabel kept her worn photocopy of the birth certificate in a tin box, gone through it like talisman. She wrote more in her diary and started to plan for a life that might return to the city one day or might remain anchored in the island that had saved them. The consequences of the discovery reached beyond torts. Local schools started to teach a curriculum about workers' rights and about how to protect documents that might matter in future investigations. The university offered internships to island youth to learn conservation techniques and oral history practices. A small foundation funded the transportation of records to municipal archives to fill gaps that had allowed illicit activity to flourish. The story inspired other communities to examine forgotten logs and to demand transparency for records once thought obsolete. In the end, what began as a desperate flight from violence became a turning point for many people. A family that ran from threats found a voice that echoed in courtrooms and in public squares. The island that had been a refuge became a place of remembrance and a hub for accountability. The journal that smelled of salt and tobacco had been a seed of truth. People who once believed that silence was safer found power in testimony and in public records. The final reckoning was not immediate, and it was not complete, but it had started a sequence of actions that would shape memory and policy. If this story moved you, please share it and help bring light to other truths waiting in forgotten places. Subscribe for more narratives of courage, discovery, and justice, and join a community that believes in making memory count. Sometimes leaving is not an end, but the beginning of a long necessary search, and the sea that once threatened
To swallow them became the path that led to a kind of reckoning.